Welcome to Natural Recovery from Suffering. This is Scott Kiloby, and I have my very special guest. Well, I have to say my best friend and practically a brother, but not by blood. Dan McLintock is with me. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Scott.
Hey. So Dan and I had he came on here before, and we were just talking about gaslighting. Dan and I can probably riff on almost any subject with KI and how repression creates our suffering. But we really wanted to come together and talk about addiction recovery early on in these podcasts because the whole work started when he and I met at my addiction treatment center. And he then later came to work there. And we were in a discovery period. And in fact, in some ways, I became a patient too, or a client, because it was a two-way street. And we were both discovering in the beginning really deep programs around the need for safety that we didn't know were there in our bodies. And I think we were just like little infants in a way in that hot tub, discovering things that we couldn't even make sense of. We were just, it's a raw discovery when you see that, oh, I'm suffering because it keeps me safe. And then, he discovered that. Dan can talk about it maybe, but to give you a little context, when we were first developing this work, we really didn't know where it was going. And that's, I think, the way that you do real inquiry, especially if you're developing it, you have to be open to go to the depths. And I think that my partnership with Dan, even though we it's like anything, we have our ups and downs, is that he will always go to the depths with me. And that's why I bring him on here, and that's why we're developing together. And so here's my problem, Dan, and I'll tell you this, is like I don't know where to start because we have so much on this subject, but I'm just going to dive in somewhere. I mean, we've got an outline here, so I'll stick to it, but I can't promise the audience that we'll be completely sticking to some solid outline because everything just brings up something else. And you'll see that probably in our conversation. But I think I want to start with before the first topic, which is what is authentic recovery. I want to say one other thing first. Dan and I are both anger repressors. So it's transparency is important because repression drives things at the surface. And when you hear a critique, the transparency, I think, requires us to explain something that, and I think it'll become clear, is that we're the kind of people who could never express things like this.
Hmm.
So the fact that you're seeing this is very much not coming from, well, I know I can't speak for Dan. We discover deep pain, anger repressors, though. And if we go deeper into the path, we find that when we come out of repression, we're angry at everybody indiscriminately. And that's important to find because that's driving our suffering at the surf or under the surface, it is. But what happens when we come out of repression is like, I don't like that, I don't like that, I don't like that. And the point is we never had that voice. And so people can misread something like this and say, well, they're just attacking 12 step. They don't understand the years of somatic work it took to do a podcast like this or share a message or a modality. So I hope you'll hear it not coming from the way I say it is like, if I can't disagree with you, I can't love you because I'm trying to get your love 12 step. So if I can't critique you, there's never going to be a partnership in the future from this anger repressor. So for me to have partnerships in the world and talk about different things and connect, I have to be able to be honest. I know Dan does too. So we're going to share some things that could trigger you. That's part of my disclaimer, is it could inadvertently trigger you. Okay, but here we go. Authentic recovery. I want to ask you about that, Dan, and I want to share about it. It's not even a phrase that I would have used probably before you and I developed the repression inquiry, but I'll just say what it means for me, and then you can say what it means for you.
Sure.
Until I even learned what the root of addiction was, I can't really say I was in authentic recovery because the root of everything was driving me, even in my recovery. I talked about this in a recent podcast, is so much recovery is driven unconsciously by the need for love and approval and safety from the buried emotions that recovery ends up looking like the suffering for a lot of people, like another version of it. And so for me, authentic recovery had to not only alleviate the suffering, but also alleviate all the shit around recovery. Right? So that I can stop
Yes.
creating suffering in these different ways and then get to the buried emotions and get to the root and have a really mature view of it and realized that I'm not going to put anything down, and I never did until my body was ready. And my mind was just trying to do things before my body was ready because it was trying to stay safe and get love and approval. That's my that's my definition of authentic recovery. But I want to hear what, because Dan's had a different journey, and how would you say it is for you?
Well, I think maybe I could start with what is inauthentic recovery, you know,
Yeah.
because I think that's what I came to uh, when I came to the Kiloby Center and met you and we started to develop the work. That's what I had been through was uh, all of the things that didn't address the root of suffering, all of the stuff that didn't get to uh, what I, as an anger repressor, was hiding, from myself and from other people, which was, buried rage, buried anger.
Yeah.
So inauthentic recovery, I mean, what it was for me at first was I just knew in my mid-20s I started to suffer. I didn't know what was going on. So I tried religion first. Then I tried 12 step. I got into that. I tried non-duality, all these different things, but I was missing the root. And when I got to you and we started like experimenting, we just started to notice, okay, what is this? What are we doing here? Like
Yeah.
what are we really doing? We're trying to resolve and end suffering. That's really the aim of what we're doing. So what I've done so far in order to fix the suffering has not resolved it. In
Hmm.
fact, I said to you a couple times, I was like, I feel like the suffering's gotten worse, like you said earlier, because of, the programming or the beliefs or the rules and stuff that I took on, in some of these paradigms.
Yeah.
So for me, I didn't realize at the time, but that was inauthentic recovery because it was belief based. It was sort of like programming based, belief based recovery where it's like I have to do this and I have to not do that and there's rules in it. And so when I got to you, that was the beginning of the authentic recovery because you were like, just basically take the top off of everything, just let yourself kind of be however you want to be. And in my case, I'd been, repressing my sexuality and I had porn addiction because of the repression of my sexuality, you know? And, um,
Yeah.
and you said something that no one really had ever said to me before was, why don't you just try to go be sexual and look at porn and then see what happens and see what comes up? Like no one had ever done that. Everyone else had said, just stop it,
Yeah.
stop doing that, be good, whatever. So that was, for me, that was the beginning of authentic recovery, which if I were to boil it down, it looks like it's basically like returning to the ability to trust myself and my
Yeah.
experience. Yeah.
Exactly. That's good. There's so much. I'm going to ask you to elaborate on some of those things because, like the rules, just if we could talk for a moment about that.
Yep.
The rules are so different, when we're different, everybody's different in terms of what rules they create, or they don't even know that they are rules. But rules are things like I'm not going to use, or I'm trying to get 30 day. It's so individual for all of us. I'm not anti-rules because to be against something is also not like, for me, it's been a transformation to see that my rules are trying to control me in the same way that my repression does. It's like if I
Yeah.
can, like trying to control my behavior because I'm trying to control my emotions. That's really what addiction feels like. And so when the control lets go, maybe that's why I was saying just go watch porn because so much control in that repression for you, not just around anger, but can you talk to people about the control around sex a little bit, porn?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So what I didn't realize was before I even started into trying to uh, get free of the porn addiction and what I thought was sexual addiction, there was already rules in place, like you're saying, like I already had
Yeah,
what I didn't know coming into it was I had the buried anger and like a lot of anger repressors, I had that I have to be good, sort of like command running in my system,
yeah,
because as an anger repressor, it's like I have to, you know, be a good boy, be nice, do the right thing, take care of people, be a good person. That's what anger repressors do. Because for us, it's like I'm overcompensating. It's like I don't want anyone to see that I have buried rage, so I have to look like a good person, basically.
hmm,
You know.
exactly, exactly.
So
Yeah, Gosh,
So
can we stop there for one moment so everybody hears that? Because God, it's just so big, Dan. I mean, most people, and I didn't either, know that so many of our efforts in recovery are just trying to be good in the eyes of whom? Well, mom and dad, really, in our bodies, but it's kind of everybody, isn't it?
it is everybody, and it's an unconscious attempt, or for most people, and definitely was for me to get met needs that I never got met. You know, it's like if I be good, then maybe, you know, people will love me or, you know, protect me or whatever it was. You know, if I'm
Yeah.
just good, if I'm good enough, you know.
Yeah, and also just another thing for people to hear is that's something I didn't know is that compulsion to be good is virtually synonymous with hold the bad back, which is hold the anger back and well, hold anything back that's not good in a way. So it's really connected. Did you find that too? I'm sure that
Yeah, and well, and that's why the sex thing came into it, right? Because I sort of was at a strange situation where I was kind of pressured into sexual addiction therapy and sexual addiction recovery, mainly by my mom, right? And so when that happened, the sex, you know, which up until that point had been pretty normal as like a teenage kid, you know, it's like pretty normally sexually active. But then when that happened, sex became bad too. It's like, oh, I have to be good, and then I have to not look at porn, I have to not masturbate, I have to, you know.
yeah. Can you tell people that a little bit of that story though with your mom so they can have context on that?
So yeah, so with my mom, we had a pretty codependent relationship. I was sort of like her little, you know, uh, surrogate husband. I was the good boy, mama's boy. And so what happened, something happened when I was 20 years old where she um, really got upset with me for being sexual, basically. I'll just leave it at that. And then she pressured me and said, "You need to go into therapy for this." She didn't say recovery right away, but she said, "We want to take you to see a therapist for sexual addiction." And so, along with that, I started to go to these sexual addiction recovery meetings, right? So I basically was pressured into doing that. But as a good boy and as a codependent, I just went right along with it. I was like, okay, you know, this is what I'm supposed to do now. And that,
Yeah.
like I said before, I was pretty normally sexual until that happened. And then, ironically, when that happened, the porn addiction, sexual acting out bumped up, right?
Mhm.
As soon as I got into to recovery. So, yeah, and so that was the beginning of me sort of taking on even more rules, right? On top of the rules I already had about you have to be a good boy, you have to repress your anger. Now it was like you have to be good, you have to not be sexual, you have to, you know, go to these meetings, you have to like basically identify as someone who is a sex addict, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and when you get
And
to the 12-step program, I was going to say that's the same thing. You're going along with that too, because that's what we do as anger repressors, right?
yeah, we go along and we just kind of like, you know, it's like you go with the program. And so I started to identify as, you know, a sex addict. And this is like in my early 20s, you know? And what I didn't realize as that was happening was that I was doing that to get, you know, initially to get my needs met, um, to get approval from her or to get forgiven or to get people in the 12-step meetings to like me or whatever it was. That's the, you know, I had to believe I was an addict and suffer in order to get that. And so what I didn't realize until, you know, whatever, 15 years later, when you and I got into the hot tub and started, you know, experimenting with inquiry, was that the core addiction was really identifying, you know, I identified as the addict and I started to suffer, right? And that was the thing that needed to be addressed and resolved. But I was just, instead of going to that route, you know, which is the identity and the repression that keeps it in place, I was hanging out in the branches, you know, and trying to say, well, if I just, you know, go for
Wow.
30 days without looking at porn, then everything will be okay, you know.
Yeah, that's amazing because we're talking about control and rules too. And when I met you, that had been your recovery is that you had certain ways of controlling your behavior, just like I did, or so many people did. And we worked through a lot of that. I remember in the early development is how you were placing rules and control on yourself. And then, but see, we weren't getting to anger repression. That's the whole thing I want to bring in because my authentic recovery started more when I dealt with the buried rage, but we were still dealing with repression back then. And that's I noticed the control of your sexuality. And that must have been the beginning of the repression work in a way, because that sexual repression was there, that control.
Yep. Yep. That was it. The reason I know that it was the first part of my recovery, the authentic recovery, was dealing with the sexual repression is because when you told me about it, I fogged out and I couldn't hear what you were saying to me. I literally
Yeah.
couldn't hear you were saying, I think sexual repression is what you're dealing with is driving
Yeah,
your
yeah.
compulsion. And I said, what? Like a couple times, like one more time, come again,
Yes.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, for the people listening, have you ever fogged out? Because when you get close to the repression goes, do something else. Think about something else. What's he saying? And that's important if you're listening to something like that, because it could be the most important thing you could hear. So just go back and listen if you fogged out and you realized it. But anyway, to go forward with this, because I want people to understand just your authentic recovery path. What point? Tell me about, we discovered the buried anger for both of us, and that was a connecting point on the development because we both had the same. Can you tell people for that, for what it is for you, authentic recovery, now that you're getting to the emotional repression, and then how does that connect to the sexual repression some way?
Yeah, so the authentic recovery now is like I was saying earlier, it's like coming back into self-trust. So that means for me, I have to get to the buried anger and I have to acknowledge it, I have to access it, I have to feel it, I have to express it. And as I do that, then I'm able to trust myself again. And then I'm able to sort of extricate myself from these identities like I'm an addict or I'm a good boy or I'm a bad person or you name it. I mean, there's so many different identities and deficiency
Yes.
stories, but that's the core of it is I'm resolving self-abandonment, which
Yep.
is the mechanism in my system that's pushing down the buried anger and the buried rage and holding it back.
Yeah.
That's the abandonment of myself because the truth is I was angry about a lot of stuff, but I could never access it, know about
Yeah.
it, show it. So
Yeah,
yeah.
because to be a good boy, how can you? That's the whole point. Because we have to look at that with recovery. If recovery rewards us, good boys and girls, then, and if we're driven by that, how damaging is that?
Yeah.
It really
Yeah.
is. Right, because it's not authentic. It's not getting to the root of things. It's playing from it or something. And a lot of our recovery, I can't speak for you, but I'm sure you would say even 12 step was really still abandoning yourself. Can you say more about that, the 12 step, about abandonment and how it continued? It did for me.
Here's the thing that I started to recognize as I was doing the emotional repression work, in my, early 40s, late 30s, whatever. The repression, the emotional repression that it created good and bad. It created like a morality or a false morality, basically. It's like if I'm in emotional repression, you know, the best I can do as far as trying to resolve my suffering is to go into that good bad duality. I'm a good person, I'm a bad person. I
Yeah.
should do this, I shouldn't do this, right?
Yeah.
So I have to rely on rules basically if I'm in emotional repression. So 12 step was perfect because 12 step said don't
Yeah.
don't act out, or if you're
Yeah.
drugs or alcohol, it's don't use, don't drink, don't act out. That's like the
Hey,
core
yeah. It's like,
principles.
Dan, be good. Just be good.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So it was
Yeah.
perfect. It was perfect for my conditioning because it was like, oh, here's another way to be good. And not only is it another way to be good, it's if I am good, then that's going to lead to a spiritual experience and freedom, and I'm going to be able to be happy.
Yeah. Well, just real quick, I meet people who are on an enlightenment path, and they're on a recovery path, and they envision it to be, well, I don't use any of the things, and then I'm the ultimate version of my good boy or girl.
Yeah.
That comes from anger repression, but they don't see it. And I'll say, okay, but if you're focused on, this is the whole thing I want to talk about. It's like we're focused on getting rid of all the behaviors before your system is ready. You see that coming from that same system. So
Yeah.
it's like that's what I want to talk about in authentic recovery and 12 step before we go further, is because you talk about 12 step, we have to talk about sobriety versus other things, because we both had issues with that. You couldn't just stop using porn even if you were in 12 step. And even though I stopped drugs and alcohol, my system wasn't done suffering. So keeping with that theme of control and rules and self-abandonment, when we have to believe, we have to be good, Dan. When we get into 12 step, we have to stop using. And that's how we're good. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about, because I've talked about it before, how not using or controlling our behavior connects to I'm having to be good. Just that part of it, the sobriety piece.
Yes. Yes, totally. So yeah, it directly connects to it. I mean, that's basically what, it's like there'll be salvation if I do the right thing, If I'm good, then I will
Yeah.
get free of this addiction, I will get free of suffering if I follow the steps, if I don't act out, if I, or
Yeah.
if you're drinking or using, it's like if I put it down, the drink, the drug, then, everything's going to be okay eventually. So
Exactly.
So
Right.
there's like a
Go ahead.
promise built into that. It's like if I'm good and I'm a recovering addict, then that's going to be my freedom ultimately.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I want to, where I want to go, because we're talking about self-trust versus our programming, right? And our programming just wants to be good. And so what does it mean? It's like the question I want to go into is, what does it mean to trust ourselves? Because it can't just be recovering to be good. Would you follow me there?
Hmm. Hmm.
Right? So for me, it's been about going to the bad, which is the anger mainly that was buried. That's bad to an anger repressor. And then I found that other addictions were connected to it, just like the science says. I mean, we hide the bad. That's what I want to talk about. Like you said, it's not just about being good. We have shame and we hide the so-called bad. You can relate to that. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. Shame was massive. Yeah. I think shame, frankly, for me is what kept me from realizing that I was angry unconsciously. And it also, shame drove me to be good, you know?
Yeah.
Because it's like deep down in the unconscious, I believed I was bad, that I was angry and I was bad and I was, you know, an addict or whatever. And so it's like that drives me even more to present as good or, virtuous or whatever.
Yeah, and plus you and I both had sex stuff. I mean, you did porn and mine sex, and then that's a really particular morally bad thing, and so you act it out in private and you hide it, and it's so connected to anger repression is what I've been telling people because we hide the anger.
Yeah, yeah, hugely, totally. And for me, it would show up like here's where I did start to notice that I might be angry was when I was in the porn and I was watching the porn, part of what got me off was like watching a guy with a woman, and there's a suffering in that for me. It's like, of course,
Mm.
it's hot to watch people have sex or whatever, and that's great, but there was a suffering part of it, and I started to realize, God, I feel like I'm angry. It's like these people can be together, but I can't, you
Hmm.
know. And there's a suffering in that kind of had a tinge of anger to it. Like, damn it, like
Yes.
why can't I do that?
Yes, because that's another good thing about to talk about is the sense of like an anger repression. It's like I have to be small and deficient. In our particular deficiency story, in our porn or our sex is always we're playing that out in some way. Like me, the submissive and the dom sub. I never took the dominant role either in porn or and there you were like not submissive, but like you're the victim of that, and you're powerless and small. And I think I want people to hear that we're
Yeah.
playing our trauma out in our addictions often.
That's it. That's totally it. Yeah. And because for me, it was like part of what I was drawn to in the porn was like the cuckold thing where it's like she's choosing him over me and he's big and I'm nothing.
Yeah.
And that's, it's like that's part of what turned me on in the porn. There's also like a lot of suffering in it. And of course, that's directly connected to the buried anger. It's like because that was a replay of my childhood situation where it's like mom is choosing the angry guy that's upset with me and her, and is, can
Yeah.
can be emotionally and mentally abusive, and she's choosing him over me. And I was angry, but I could not feel and
Yeah.
express that. I could not get to that.
Right.
Wasn't
And that's
safe.
just, God, that's the root of the suffering. Because I know you so well, and I know that that was the root of your suffering, because I know because you're like me, you were the good boy, and you never showed that, but it was there in those moments throughout your
Yep.
life. Yeah. Okay. So here's another question or a topic related is I don't know if people are aware of SLA or SA and what those stand for, if you can explain it. And were you in both of those?
Yeah, I was just in essays. Essay is Sexaholics Anonymous, and SLAA is Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, I think. There's a couple different ones, but anyways, the one I was in was Sexaholics Anonymous Essay, and it was here in the South in Jacksonville, Florida, and it's pretty strict. It was pretty the more religious of the programs, right? So it was very sort of strict and talk about good, bad, moralistic, you know.
Mm-hmm.
They were like, you know, you can't have sex unless you're in a marriage, basically. There's like masturbation counts as slipping and relapsing, you know. So it was very strict.
Right, but that, I mean, into your unconscious, that attached, right? Because then you can be good. Those are the rules.
Yeah, yeah, it was perfect. Yeah, if I can just never masturbate and since I'm not married, never have sex with anyone, then I'm a good boy. And then, you know, good things
Yeah.
are coming, you know.
Well, that's the whole thing about rules, though, because you have the rules, but then the compulsion comes from the body, and it's like, fuck the rules. I want what I want. And it creates that. And then you have the shame when you act out on it. And I know you did too have that. So that's the thing I hear when we're talking is like the holding of that back through the rules is a part of the problem because it's part of repression.
Yep. And it for me it drove, you know, you know this because I you saw it happen, but I would try to repress and abstain for periods of time and then it would just explode into like a binge with porn. It's like it's because the repression itself, you know, that energy has to go somewhere eventually. And so it's like you push it down, push it down, push it down, then it just goes boom, you know, and just
Yeah.
there's the binge. So repression drives the compulsion, repression drives the binging and the relapsing, you know.
Yeah. And then often the recovery because you have to be good. And yeah. So here's another thing I want to talk. I don't know if you remember this, but like in the hot tub, we were focused on shame a lot, like processing that. I know I was when you would facilitate me. Remember that?
Yeah. Yep.
And it was only later that we discovered, and I know you did too. I mean, in your own experience, that shame protects us. Is how I say it. You can put it in your own words, but like this is something that's hard to express to people who haven't done work with repressed emotions because you can't feel the buried anger or hurt or sadness, but the shame comes up. And it's like, what is that? It's an emotion, but it's not something that we express to people. It's not like sadness or hurt. And we were focused on it. And I know you were too for a while. I think mainly because we hadn't gotten to the buried anger. Would you agree?
Yeah, we did a lot of work around that. I think for me, because there was so much shame around the sexual stuff, and some with you too, I think. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's like since we didn't know that the anger was there buried underneath, you can only go so far with looking at dealing with shame, you know, because this is how I explain it. You know, like if I'm working with somebody else that's had any kind of addiction stuff, it's like at some point when you were a kid, you learned that you had to be ashamed of yourself, you know?
Hmm.
And I certainly did, that I had to be ashamed of my anger, my power, my sexuality, my masculinity. I learned from both parents that I had to do
Yeah.
that. So there's this program now that's running that says I have to be ashamed of myself, right? And it's like that came into existence to protect me, to almost like distract me and to protect me from knowing that I was angry,
Mm. Yeah,
you
totally.
know? And so and so that's the thing, like, you know, I got into the hot tub and we started doing this work and it was like, we're just trying to dismantle the protection, basically, you know?
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
I heard Peter Levine say, I shared that with you. He said, shame when you're a kid is like at least you have control over an otherwise uncontrollable environment in which you can't, and I would elaborate, he didn't say this, but you can't get angry if you're an anger repressor. So that shame protects us. But what you and I discovered through utility inquiry is that there's a benefit from the shame, and you're alluding to it, and we're both talking about it, that the shame protects us. And with our utility inquiry, we discovered that it protects us from, well, I'll say it what it was for me, is you've already said it. It protects me from anyone ever seeing my anger,
yeah.
mainly.
Yep. Yep. Totally. And it's almost in a weird way too. It got my needs met because if I could just be ashamed of myself enough, then mom and dad would be like, "Yeah, good boy, good
Yeah.
boy. That's right. You should feel ashamed."
Yeah, yeah. It's like Pavlov's dogs. It's like we learned earlier, not to get angry and then we get the reward and you're a good boy, but you feel shame, but that's okay because you're just trying to get a reward again.
Yep.
Okay, there's more here. Is there anything coming up for you? Like, does this bring up areas that you want to go into? I have a next area, but
I think the only other thing is, like you said, Pavlov's dogs. It's like if you get shamed by parents or by your culture or society or whatever it is, if you get shamed as a kid or you get humiliated, it's like we internalize it. It's like we get taught to do it to ourselves almost.
mm,
And I think that's been really helpful in the repression work is to go, okay, if I'm feeling ashamed at some level in the body, I'm shaming myself, and then I have to shame myself.
yes, yes. It's deep. It's actually an attack, isn't it? Because I remember found it with my chronic pain. I probably said it to you. I was like, I found I have to hurt myself. And by holding the anger back, and then I remember working with people with migraines and they would have like I have to attack myself. And it's just safer for anger repressors to have that internal attack that includes shaming ourselves, but it's like a self-attacker. It's like a holding your it's an abandonment of yourself, really, but it's very
Yeah.
internally aggressive. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And so for you, like because I know how I look at it, if I find that self-attack or that self-shaming or that self-abandonment, how I work with it, how do you take it in? Not going into too much detail, but how do
Hmm.
you process that? Yeah.
Yeah, like my chronic pain was really just that. It was anger repression. So I found that I couldn't hurt them because I couldn't express anger to them. If I express anger to them, that's hurting them because I had abandoned that part of myself, anger. I never discovered like a healthy that anger is just okay. It doesn't always hurt people. But anyway, internally, it was I have to hurt myself because I can't hurt them. And then hurting myself over time became this chronic pain, of course, other things, addiction. But I found it in the chronic pain, this conditioning that says, I have to hurt myself. I have to hurt myself. It's just my
Yep.
words for it.
Mine would be I have to sh shame myself, or I have to be ashamed of myself, right? And then as soon as I said, as soon as I looked at the people that taught me that and go, I'm not angry that I have to be ashamed of myself. I'm not angry that I have to be in shame all the time. Then my body just goes, oh, yes, I am. You know? And then
Yeah.
there it is. There's the
Yeah.
beginning of the processing. But yeah.
Exactly. Is there anything else on self-trust versus our programming? Because we talked about that and we touched on it a little bit. It's such a deep issue because to me, authentic recovery is self-trust. And we're talking about how when we process buried emotions, we really trust ourselves. I mean, really do. And that's the recovery. But anything else you want to say about that before we go into some other areas, like critiquing 12 step a little bit more?
Yeah, well, maybe this might segue into that. A couple things I did like about 12 step was one of the things is the step work. Like when I started to do step work with a sponsor and like a really good sponsor who would take me through, it felt like the for me the beginning or the front end of deprogramming. So I feel like it was a good start into spirituality because it's deconstructive. Like the steps are like you start to deconstruct what you believe. And so one of the things that I appreciated about it and really liked about it, especially at first, was like in the step work, there'd be a couple times, like after reading a personal inventory, which is step 5, where you read it and you basically get a bunch of stuff off your chest. It's like a bunch of resentment and fear and grievances and guilt. You're dealing with that. And then again, when you make amends, there's like some openings and some glimpses that happen of presence and of peace of mind, and you start to experience those. And that's like, oh, okay. So whatever this is, there's something still good that's happening in me. And so you start to sort of follow that trail.
Yeah. And then what happens?
And then and then this is the thing I said to you over and over again is that the suffering would just kick back in. And sometimes, it would kick back in even stronger. I used to call it whiplash. I'm like, yeah, I just did a really great, fifth step, and then and the next week it was just
Yeah.
like boom, like I'm suffering again. So
Yeah. That's the pleasure pain cycle right there. Is it's so if people could understand this little point right here that he's talking about that everybody experiences, right there is when he just said it, it's like I'm good. It's like I'm safe. I'm doing something, I'm better. And then that's our trauma response is always going for good. And then here comes the anger repression kicking in more suffering. But when you're on a path like that, you don't know that the things that you're doing are about to kick in the suffering. And you don't know that because you're not processing buried emotions, you can't even deal with that cycle. I don't know if that makes sense, or if you want to say anything about that.
yeah, no, it totally does. And it's funny because as you say it, it reminds me of like I was never Catholic, but like the Catholic Church where it's like there's a lot of, this is good, this is bad, this is a sin,
Yeah.
this is, okay or whatever. And so you're in that, and then you have to go in and confess your sins, and then you feel better for a little while, and then, but then,
Yeah. You
you
got to
still,
masturbate. You have to go
yeah, exactly,
masturbate. Yeah.
exactly,
Exactly.
yeah,
I want to make it real because it's like that little kid's got to go masturbate. It's like nobody taught him that that's part of life too.
yeah,
You
yep,
know,
yeah, totally. So that's the pleasure pain cycle. I mean, it just you get locked into that, It's like there's no, as long as the repression that's creating both the morality and the compulsion and abstinence is dealt with, then you're just locked into that cycle.
totally. And so we're talking about being good, and we have to talk about relationship and codependency, um, and 12 step. So, first of all, before I think we've made clear that, like, I think you said that when you tried to stop, before we do the codependency, because that's about somebody helping you, but when you tried to stop, it always would kick back the porn, is what you would say too.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Well, what's the most that you would get? Do you mind saying that you would go without just so people could hear?
I think my tops was I did one time I had 17 months.
Okay. Yeah. And that's just what the rules, and the rules are no sexual unless in a marriage?
Yeah, unless you're married, and by the way, it has to be a marriage between a man and a woman.
Right, right,
You
of
know,
course. So I
of
wouldn't
course.
qualify there. Yeah.
Yeah, so you wouldn't be able to be sober in that program, but
I wouldn't be able to have sex at all or do anything if I was in that program.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. But
That's
neither
right.
could I because I wasn't married. So
Okay.
there's no sex with self and no sex with anyone other than your spouse.
Okay. And so then now what you know now, how did that kick in your own words, almost like the need to not only act out on the porn, but then when you go to talk to a sponsor, tell me what that's like after you've done that.
It's like going to the priest. I mean, it's like going back to confession. It's like, oh God, I have to go back to my sponsor and I have to go back to my group and just tell them what I did.
Yeah.
And that's,
Right.
oh man, talk about reinforcing shame. It's like, that's the worst. It's like, yeah, it was bad. And you saw me, Scott, because anytime that I would be sexual, I would have this aftermath for like a couple of days where I just couldn't even look at anybody. It'd be like a shame
Yeah.
storm.
Totally. Also the thing that comes up for me, just listening to your story, because it's different than mine, but so similar, is that with as anger repressors, if we do something bad, if we have a sponsor or a teacher, like that's the fucker that we're angry at because we're angry at dad. And so, but we can't express the anger to the person who we already feel ashamed around.
It's they're the authority, and that's where I learned to repress myself was in the face of an authority as a kid.
Yeah.
So it's like this authority comes in and says, you know, you got to answer to me and you got to be, you know, sober or whatever. It's just like, okay, there it is. There's the
Yeah.
trauma.
I mean, a majority of sponsors that you had were like that. I mean, I know there's one that's good. And I want you to talk about him in a second, but not yet, because I want people to hear the critique because there's a lot of sponsors who just don't process buried emotions, and that's an important thing. Or the trauma work is not there in that program, and so a lot of codependency happens before we talk about your one good sponsor. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I'll mention him in a second here. In 12 step, it's like one of the uh, methods or one of the things that they say you have to do in order to stay sober is to carry the message to other people. So you're basically forced into sponsoring. It's like the 12 step is you carry the message to other people, so you have to start working with other people. So
Yes.
so you know,
Yes. I just think about myself like I'm just going along. It's like just give me love. I'll just do service work. Just tell me what to do. But I don't understand that I'm getting rewarded that whole time and that my buried anger is behind that.
yep, totally. Because we're getting our, if we're doing the right thing. We're getting our needs met by going along and repressing the buried anger the whole time.
Yeah, and also just staying sober because then that's part of it. It's like now I don't have a solution to my problem other than I can only get love and approval in a way. I can't use my drug because if I use my drug, I can't get love and approval. But it's all coming from anger repression.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
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 Okay. Anything else you want to share there?
Yeah. One more thing is that, I mean, Scott and I both, we've talked about codependency in some of the videos and shorts that we've done, but codependency, I think at its most basic really is just the repression, frankly, I think mostly of anger. And this is what I say to people when they come into KI and they're sort of coming out of or trying to deprogram from 12 step is it's like your first surrogate parent was the addiction itself. Like the addiction was the thing that kept you safe and the thing that soothed you and like regulated your nervous system. And so there's your first surrogate parent. And then you get into recovery and you wean off of the addiction and now you wean onto a sponsor. And then that's the next surrogate parent is this sponsor. But the whole time, the trauma and the repression were created by our parents and by our authorities, as
Mhm.
kids. And so and
Wow.
so if that repression isn't addressed, I'm just going to stay in the same dynamic with my sponsor where you're the dad or the older authority or the mom if you're a female or whatever, and then I'm the kid, you know,
Yeah.
and I'm getting my needs met by doing the right thing for my sponsor. I'm getting their approval, getting their love. So yeah.
Yeah, it's so true. And the science is reflecting that because I just want to say that. So, in case people don't read it, it's like if you look closely at the science, it's saying a lot of our trauma is buried anger, not all of it, but a lot of it. And the buried anger is more responsible than any other repression. And repression is the root of many forms of suffering. So, buried anger is very much behind our suffering. And then when we're kids and the addictions start, the science says buried anger is behind the addiction. When we get into recovery, science is saying buried anger is behind the codependency. And we could keep going, but like it's behind our spiritual search after 12 step, which is beyond the scope of this podcast. But if people can see the magnitude of what we're saying when we say these things about codependency and authentic recovery, because if the root of all this isn't dealt with, then we're just continuing in the same cycle.
Yeah, it's that we're just, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, basically, with trying to
Yeah.
deal with all these symptoms, of the one thing that we haven't gone to, which is the buried emotions.
Yeah. So that heart, you just that you got a lot of rage for the past, just like me, because you've had to deal with that because from a little early age, or for you as little as an early age, you couldn't speak up, you couldn't disagree. I guess you would agree with me. And then the whole thing is like just stuffing everything down with some addiction, and then you get into recovery and you still can't do it. And it's like that is a big part of it is discovering later during our authentic recovery, we have to go back and own all that.
Yes. Yes, totally. Honestly, it was such a relief to finally do that. To finally when we started like tapping into the anger, I know for me it was like, oh my God, yes, this is the thing. This is the thing
Mhm.
that's been underneath,
Yes.
all these other forms of suffering. Yeah, and so, there were a couple of good things I liked about, like I mentioned earlier, especially the sort of beginning of deconstruction of the beliefs in the step work and, the glimpses of awareness and presence that you get. But these are kind of the main points that I think are what I would critique about the 12 step. being someone who's been through it and come out of it, The first one is most of the work that is done in the steps is cognitive work, meaning it's like it's of the mind and it's, sort of like writing stuff down on paper, looking at resentments, considering things. It just 12 step, it's infamous for leaving the body out of the process. I know there's a couple people that would say, feel the emotions when you're talking about the stuff that would come up, but for the most part, the body was left out. And definitely buried emotions and the root of suffering is left out if the body's left out, because that's where the emotional repression lives.
Yeah, and if you start doing with that, you have to deal with the thing that makes us want to get love and approval that way. So it's like you can't go to that. Do you know what I mean?
Yep. It would mess up the process if you did. Like that story that I talked about in my video, the critique of 12-step recovery, where the woman that busted a friend of mine because he was talking about approval addiction in an AA meeting, and she came up to him afterwards and said, that's not what this is about. Do not ever talk about that in here.
Oh,
You know?
really? You told me about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, well, there it is. That's the giveaway that, there's something else here under the radar.
Yeah. Okay. So what else in terms of you were saying the critique? Sorry, I interjected there.
Yeah, no, good. So cognitive, most of it's cognitive is my first critique point. Second is that there's so much addiction hopping that happens. It's like this is a term we use where it's like, somebody will get sober. Let's say that they're addicted to, cocaine or something, and they're in NA and they get sober, and then they start caffeine or they go to sexual addiction or something. It's like their systems will just kind of, since they can't do the cocaine, now I'm going to find something else that I can hop to that fills the hole, that
Yeah.
soothes since I can't do it with the cocaine.
Right,
But
right. Substitution, they call it in the clinical. Remember that term we used to use in the substituting.
yeah, and so the thing that gets missed in, I think, frankly, gets missed in the 12-step communities is that the addiction to support and approval and community. It's like it's perfect for our unmet needs. It's perfect for our emotional repression to move from the drug or the drink or the addictive behavior to, the support or the approval of a sponsor or a group,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Because like we have the same consciousness as when we were kids that just wants to get approval in any relationship, and yet that dynamic isn't being dealt with within us?
Yep. Yeah. It's not it's not being addressed. It's not even being acknowledged. And when it is acknowledged, people go, quiet down there.
It makes me, Dan, it makes me think I remember when I stopped going to meetings for even a few days, I would start feeling bad. And I now know what that is. I used to think, oh, that's my addiction. Of course it is, but addiction is so much bigger than just using. It's like, it's about buried anger and getting love and approval. And if you stop going to a meeting, it's like, that's my addiction. I
Yeah.
miss that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, totally. And you share a little bit more. I know you've talked to me about when you stopped, like with the painkillers and stuff, that you shifted to other things. Like, what was your
Yeah.
experience with that? Yeah, the
Well,
addiction hopping.
I was telling you that just this morning that when I, okay, so when I was quitting alcohol and drugs when it was really bad, I was on my couch and I was just like a little infant and I was moaning like an infant and calling out for help, and my brother and my family came to rescue me, which is the first thing that you would think you would want to do, but there's the dynamic that was already toxic and dysfunctional. And so there came the rescuers and the codependent father and family. They were doing the
Yeah,
best they could, and I was playing the role as the finally helpless, the powerless, anger repressing addict. But see, as soon as I walked into the room, it's like, okay, so you love me even as I am, and that's important in the beginning to feel, at that stage. But it has to go deeper than that because at that point, once I understood I could get that love and approval
yeah,
at an unconscious level, it was on and there was no stopping it,
yeah,
because I just kept doing service work and I was tying it to sobriety. And then, because if I could stay sober and keep doing this, and then my sponsor loves me and all these people like me, then I'm good. I'm back
yeah,
to good. See?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, totally.
but I never
Yeah,
dealt with the well, real quick, I never dealt with the root because that was what was driving all that. And so, I mean, I could go into details, but that I had to leave the program eventually because I didn't have the words for it, but I didn't get to the root of it, and so I didn't know how to there.
it's it's kind of like like people go into harm reduction on their own. It's like they stop
Hmm.
the main drug, and then they go, oh well, I'll go over here to the approval or to the
Yeah.
pornography or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Well, that kind of like the question is where do you go from there? I mean, I want to keep talking about. Do you have any other critiques of 12 steps? Because I know listeners are listening for that in the title. We've named a few things. There's some definitely good things about it. Everybody decides on their own, but I'm trying to think of the addict identity. You and I talked about that so long for so many years, but let's talk about it a little bit. Maybe we talked about it some, but that's
yeah,
a part of it. Because when I came to the 12 step, it's like part of getting the approval is that you have to buy into that, and you're okay with that because it's like, well, that's what I am, and they accept me, you
yeah,
know. And then you get the love through that, or I did, and for years I didn't understand that getting my needs met through that identity too, because that identity became a source of suffering for me, as any identity does. But it started as a source of getting love and approval. It's just any identity is limiting and it has to go, and that one didn't want to go.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, because it's a special one, it feels like that identity is really special. Because I think it's framed as like, you have to sort of face the truth about yourself, in the meetings. It's like you really have to believe that you're an alcoholic or you're an addict and that you're powerless. Like you really you know, have to believe that. And then, like you said, we do in order to get the approval and support of the group. And also, this is the built-in promise and that identity is that if you believe it enough, then you'll stop drinking, using, or acting out.
Hmm.
And then your suffering will go away. So that to me, if I were to say what's my biggest critique, it's that point because that's saying basically you have to believe this about yourself, which on some level is, even if we don't know it, is going to cause suffering
Yeah.
in order to stop suffering. So you have to suffer and believe this identity about that this is who you are, and
Yeah.
so that you stop suffering. And that feels like not only a critique, but I mean like that feels like a really big bamboozle, like a gaslight almost. Yeah.
It does. It reminds me of childhood though, because you have to believe those things too. Like it's not maybe so conscious, but you have to believe you're nothing or a loser in that way too. And when you get to the 12 step, well, I have to believe that too. It's such an unconscious activity until you do work with buried emotions. You don't know that your identities are compulsions. I have to believe that. I have to believe I'm an addict. And that's why it was so hard to let go of that because to do inquiry on that, you have to get into the body because there's such a, as you know, a body thing to it. It's not just I am an addict. I have to believe it because that's how I get
Yeah.
love.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the system starts to fight. It's already been fighting, since childhood for or arguing for suffering, but it really starts to fight even harder with the addict identity. It's like, no, this is what I am. I remember a couple of friends of mine, even when I was sort of deep into the program, said to me, like, do you really want to believe that about yourself? And I would get defensive. I'm like, well, that's
Mhm.
I am. I mean, that's what it's like, golly, like in the moment, didn't even recognize it's like I'm arguing uh, uh, for my limitations.
Yeah. Well, this we're into kind of the codependency topic, and we're still on the topic of 12 step. I want to go deeper on that because I know you had a good sponsor, and I want to bring him in a second. So I don't think you talked about him, but just in terms of specific relationships, I'll share a little bit without sharing names.
Yeah.
What I noticed about one of my sponsors that I really stayed with was people liked him. See, that was something that I didn't know I picked up on, and I always wanted to be loved, and so I mimicked some of his way too. There's a lot of that too. It's like you meet somebody and you don't know who you are because how could you? You've already abandoned yourself, right? And
Yeah.
then you're watching somebody else. And for me, it was like I wanted. What did he have that I wanted that made it not healthy? Well, anytime you're in a relationship where somebody's helping you, this is what I want to talk about, and you already have buried anger, it's like you're already at a major disadvantage in a way because you have no power. That's what it felt like. And I didn't know that I had no power. And I didn't know that my bond with my sponsor was coming from that. So when you bond with anybody who has power over you, that's tricky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We always say, but authority issues or emotional repression issues, because that was, you know, if I give somebody power over me, then I'm going to have the same relationship with them that I had with my dad or my mom or both of them. You know, it's so much
Mhm.
transference happens without us even knowing it, you know. And if that's happening, that means that emotions are staying buried, you know.
Yeah. It's almost like we don't know how to relate to anyone with repression, and we've been doing it the same way, people pleasers and peacemakers since we were kids. And it's the only thing we know when we get into recovery and sponsorship relationships is we just go immediately to that, as with people with buried anger, we go immediately to that way of relating to people.
Yep. And I think nobody that I'd ever I mean, I definitely was not doing emotional repression work at that point, but nobody that ever sponsored me had done any kind of work like that. So I think pretty much every one of my sponsors was codependent except for one guy. And I don't know where he came from or how he dealt with his
Yeah.
buried emotions or what, but he really was not codependent with me. And it was really helpful, actually. It's probably the most
Yeah.
helpful sponsor I had. Yeah. So,
Tell us some details about him. What he said, you mean?
yeah. So he, he was actually a guy, he worked the AA steps with people in so many different programs in AA and Al-Anon and SA. And so when I first started working with him, the first thing he said to me was we got on the phone and he just said really directly, just, I'm not here to be your friend, you know?
Oh,
You might,
can we stop there for a second?
yeah,
um as soon as you said that, I was like, oh, okay, so he might be able to love me. That's how it felt because, and I know that, I don't know how people feel that way, but how did you feel when he said that? That's just that right there.
it was the weirdest sensation. There's three things I'm going to talk about that he said, but it was the weirdest
Yeah.
sensation because I was shocked by it, but I was like, there was like relief. I was like, oh, thank God.
Mhm. Yeah,
You know?
right. Because what I want to say before you move on is like, for someone who is avoidant, if I would have had a sponsor that said that, I would have felt space in some way, you know?
Yeah,
I wouldn't have wanted to get away from them so much, is what I mean.
totally. Totally. Yeah, it was really powerful. And every time I talked to him, there would be at least one thing that he said that would do that, where it would just stop me in my tracks. And I go, "Oh my God," you know.
Hmm.
It reminds me of like I know Anthony DeMello talks about the most effective spiritual teachers. They're the ones that challenge your beliefs and the belief systems that make you unhappy. That they just have they know how to do that. They can just challenge it and go, you know, stop you in your tracks like that. So the second thing he said was, and this was probably halfway through our relationship as sponsor sponsee, was he said, I think I was talking to him about a relationship that I had, like a friendship I had with this guy, and I didn't really want to be friends with him, but I felt like I had to. And then all of a sudden he just said, when are you going to stop betraying yourself?
Yeah.
And and it was the same thing. I didn't even know what that meant, but my body just went, what? You know what I mean? Like, oh my
Hmm.
God, like I'm doing that, you know? Like,
Yeah. Well, you want him to elaborate more when he says it because it's so true. But you felt it anyway.
yeah, it was just one of those moments. And it always felt like he was saying something so directly, and it wasn't my system. Half of me thought he was being mean, but then the other half was like, that's not mean.
Right.
That's very helpful. And I somehow like that, you know? So it's just that directness that coming from love, you know?
Yeah. Is there anything else that he said like that? Because we're picking on the sponsors, but codependency is just what it is. But
Yeah.
anything else that we can pull out of his conversation?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So the third thing was that he said to me was, and this was after we had worked through the steps the first time, and I came back to him to we got to know each other a little bit, and I came back to him to work the steps again. And he said, I'm not going to do that because I don't think you're an addict. And this guy he was an alcoholic. He was diagnosed
Mhm.
alcoholic, and he was an SA. And he just straight up just said, I don't think you're an addict, you know? And he went a little in. more into it and said, I think you're dealing with codependency and the family disease of alcoholism. So you might try like Al-Anon or ACOA or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, but that just totally threw me for a loop because I'd been identifying as an addict for the last, whatever, 5 years. And then at the end of working the steps with him, he just said, I don't think that's what you are. And I think you need to, I'm not going to work with you. I think you need to go pursue something else, which ended up being Scott Kiloby's work. So,
Yeah, that's so weird that he said codependency or Al-Anon because we came together and we ended up not working on the codependency at first. It wasn't until we got to the buried anger that we found, I think that we probably know what that means, right? Because that's his way of saying you kind of need to get to the root in a way. That's what I
yeah,
hear. Yeah.
it is.
But yeah, I was going to ask you this though, because your experience is somewhat different than some people. Like some people are just all out heroin addicts, they use every day. And for them, they might have a different experience at first with 12 step because if they don't get clean, whatever, they might die. That happens. But for he must have seen something in you that was like in you abandoning yourself that was creating the problem. You know what I mean? Can you say more about that?
Yeah, yeah, I think he spotted it, and I'm not sure he knew what to attribute it to. It's almost like a doctor saying, I'm not sure how to treat you, but you might go look into this, you might go check this out. But yeah, I think he just saw that I he was the only person really, I think, that it saw that I had started in on this path of 12 step or whatever in order to please other people. So it's like my addiction was that self-betrayal and going along with, like we've talked about, being good. And he cared enough about me to tell me the truth. And he always used to say, I care more about you than I do about your feelings.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost true for everybody though. Even if you had that experience, I don't know if you're any different than anyone else because when I just said that, I was using opiates every day when I went to 12 step. And even though focusing on it as an addiction helped me in the beginning. At some point, I got to the same place where it's like I needed to get to the root. I had codependency. I don't like these words because it's like buried anger drives the addiction and drives the codependency. And it's better to say it's buried anger
Yeah,
because you get
yeah.
too confused. It's like you go, now I'm going to go to Al Anon. Well, I hope they're talking about buried anger because they weren't talking about it at 12 step. It's like, but how do you
Right.
know that?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I guess you don't until you spend 2 years in a hot tub and then you get spinal stenosis and I get a massive stomach contraction. And then we start going,
True.
okay, what is the deal? Like, what is this? Like
Oh,
what
yeah.
is
Yeah, lo and behold, trust your body. Exactly. That's what it
yeah.
took. Okay,
So
so anything else in codependency? I mean, we're really talking about codependency because we could talk about it in the context of our early training years after 12 step and we had to work on codependency, but we've already talked about that. So I want to talk about it just for people in 12 step. Anything else? I'm going to try to share something else here. I think my codependency was more yeah, it was part of it was getting love and approval by the group. Did you get that too? That hit, not just a sponsor.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that was I need the group to support me and to say, oh yeah, okay, he's good, he's sober, he's doing it the right way. And I think yeah, that was big for me. Yeah, and helping too, right? Did you have yeah, you sponsored people too, right? Like you
Yeah.
helped a lot.
Yeah, it just reminds me of narcissism for some reason because it's like we make a big deal out of narcissists, but like when we go into recovery, we're all in this room together. We have buried anger, hurt, and fear that we don't know about, and we're all just getting each other's love and approval by doing different things, and we never show that side of ourselves. And then if that happens, it's called a relapse, and you're outside of the group. And then now you have to get back into the group, but in order to get back into the group, you have to go back into that. And that conformity. Did you experience that?
Yeah. Oh my God. I mean, that's why I had a refrain that kept coming up in my system of like, this is an impossible situation.
Mm.
Like this is just impossible. And the thing that for me that was impossible was I couldn't access myself. I couldn't be myself in that environment. I really couldn't because I had to either I was identifying with an addict, yeah, as an addict in order to get approval, or I was trying to not use, or I was shaming myself if I did use. And so I just couldn't get to it's like I lost myself.
Yeah. It's almost like a survival for me, a survival way of recovery at first, because it's like, what else do you do when you don't have a level of consciousness to know what's driving it? You just so you do the best you can. But at the same time, I want to ask you this, like, without people, my recovery was different because nobody pressured me into it to 12 step.
Yeah.
What happened is like it got really bad and I was on the couch like a little infant. But that was about everybody else and hiding and stuff, of course. But when you look back at it, knowing that it was codependency or buried anger, how does the pressure, we've talked about pressure. Can we say more about that? Like external pressure becomes internal. Well, what would you say it is now? We used to say internal pressure, but it's anger repression. That the way that we deal with external pressure from people is like we'll give in to or go along with it. That's what I wanted to say earlier. Say any more about that?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's the the thing that we perceive for me that I perceived as external pressure was really, yeah, the repression of my emotions and the repression of myself, and that's huge because it's like, okay, whether or not they're actually pressuring me or whatever I think they're doing to me, I'm already doing it to
Yeah,
myself.
exactly. Right, because Dan and I used to live together, and like when he would watch porn, I would not, if I remember, come and say, "Dan, did you watch porn again last night?"
Yeah.
But no, or not even say it that way. It's like you don't want to be in denial of someone who's going through something, but it's like you don't realize that somebody's already beating themselves up if you don't do that deep work. And even the smallest of words creates this prison for the person where they can't share anything. Can you share anything about that? Because I know we talked about that, where it's like you'd have to hide it. You'd have to remember regurgitating the truth the next morning.
Yes, of course. Yeah, many times. And yeah, it was amazing because I could tell, I used to binge on porn for like 8, 10 hours. It was crazy, like all night. It would just be horrendous. And I'd be bloodshot eyes and just shame all over.
Hmm.
And then Scott would like come in the morning or, I'd see him the next day and he would say, hey, how's it going? And I would confess immediately, of course, but then he'd be like, oh, cool. Want to go get some lunch?
Yeah.
We can talk about it if you want to. I'm like, what? Like, aren't you gonna judge me or tell me I did something wrong or whatever? And he's like, no. It would just be like, no, I'm just kind of interested in like what came up for you after that and what are you? Yeah, nobody had ever done that before. So
Yeah, I don't know if it was just where I was, but also there was codependency between you and me. Let's talk about that in the beginning, in the sense that
yeah,
we didn't know how to hold each other's feet to the fire. The thing about us is that we were both earnest and we would inquire. And so a lot of times we didn't have to because people don't look inward. There's more codependency. But there was definitely stuff between you and me. Like I think we could have gotten to anger repression earlier somehow if there wasn't, somehow
yeah,
maybe.
yeah, I do totally. Yeah, and I think some of it probably was the teacher student dynamic, because to me
Yeah.
you were like the Eckhart or the Adyashanti or whatever, and I came in. And I definitely like had you on a pedestal, and you tried to get me to stop doing that pretty quickly. But I think I couldn't ever fully do it until I started doing the repression work because my buried emotions will automatically authoritize people. Whether it means
Yes.
I'm gonna deify them or demonize them or whatever it is. It's like that's the
Yes.
function of it.
That's so true. And then knowing that we're both anger repressors, as I did this work and I knew that there was codependency and that I was the teacher, I've always known that your recovery would just be your own self-trust and your own life. And that's tricky because when I first met you, it's like I was codependent and needed your love from the buried anger. I needed that. And so I've had to do work around that. It's like
Yeah.
every relationship. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And so we've had to learn like little by little how to kind of relate to each other more authentically. And I think, yeah, I mean, you really have helped me with that too, because I just feel like that's something I never did with anybody. And so it does feel like coming out of repression. It's like I'm learning how to show up more as myself.
Yeah, that's what it's about. Because when you think about it, the whole talk we're doing is about you abandoning yourself. And then it's just me, somebody helping you. It's like, God, if anything I do contributes to that, that's how I see it at this point. And I'm just trying to get clear as a helper around stuff like that is not doing anything inadvertently to help someone abandon themselves.
Yep. Well, I mean, I think you're pointing, we both are pointing to buried anger in ourselves, and we're both aware that that's the root of it. So I think, to me, that's what's most important is because that got left out of so many other things that I tried. Even when we developed the basic KI, it's like that got left out because we didn't know about it yet.
Yeah.
We weren't there, but
Yeah.
but
No,
we,
no, we were still abandoning ourselves.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else about the codependency piece and just 12 step before we move on?
Just that the helping, within KI, I think we've talked about this some, but the helping, trying to get my needs met by helping other people, that's probably been one of the biggest. It's hard to come out of that, but I've been doing it, and I think I just got sick for like a month. I got pneumonia in January, and I think some of that was burnout. Like I realized that I'd been,
Mm,
you know, neglecting myself and my own needs and trying taking care of other people, and so I just got really sick
yeah.
and I noticed when I was sick, I started to feel guilty, like, oh, I should be getting back to helping other people. And,
Mm,
Dana, my wife, was like, dude, you have pneumonia, you might die. You know what I mean? Like like you need to take care of yourself. But there it is, right? And so I've really been working with that compulsion to help and fix and take care of others over myself. And of course, right underneath that is more buried anger and fear.
I totally think so. I mean, I think it's an epidemic. I think there's a lot of helpers and sponsors who do many years of helping, and they're lucky if they don't get a disease that comes from that trauma. They're just lucky. And then if you can get a small disease that'll just slow you down a little bit to get you to see something, it's sometimes helpful because, disease often comes from repression
Yeah, yeah,
or just our susceptibility to it. So just like it showed you some insight, didn't it? And that's what happened to me is I was still in that unconscious helping thing with the chronic pain, and then I was just forced to stop because it was too painful helping, and then I was off work. That was my moment. It was a month of not being able to help, and that I started to shift out of that more codependent helping. That was, remember that a few years ago.
yeah, yeah, I do, definitely. Yeah, I guess this was mine. I wasn't aware of it, but I think this was mine. It was just so much more awareness around it.
Hmm.
So, yeah, one more thing about 12 step too is they talk about how what drives addiction is a spiritual malady. They talk about it in the literature a lot, and that it blocks you off from yourself or from your spirit. And I think that's true. I really do think that's true, and that's the closest they get to saying what the root of suffering is, because
Yeah.
that's actually true that I think it is a spiritual malady, but get more specific, 12 step, and say it's actually buried emotions and the beliefs that are attached to the buried emotions. It's like that's what it is. I mean, let's just be cut and dry and say, not mince words and say it's emotional repression, you know?
Yeah,
That's what's
exactly.
blocking you off from yourself, and that's what's driving you to drink or use or act out.
It's so true. And then, just like speaking of critique, is critique spirituality in my own teaching because you don't even pay attention to science, which is saying, hey, no matter what you call that, that's buried anger. And so we don't pay attention. And then we stay in our little world, like our 12 step world or our spiritual world. And that's part of it, isn't like the worldviews. When you speak of like 12 step, everything can be this worldview that you're locked into for safety. And you can't hear other things anyway. And it's like it's like a prophylactic, nothing can get in, nothing can
Yeah.
get out.
It,
And you're just in that, you don't even know that the malady has anything to do with buried emotions. Nobody's
yeah,
talking about it.
that's right. No one's saying it. And that's why I feel so moved to just say it as much as possible. You know what I mean? So we're saying this in videos and we're saying this when we talk to people, and it's like just because repetition, of course, it's the mother of clarity, but it's like nobody's saying that. And maybe if someone had said to me, like that's not addiction, that's emotional repression, or that's not depression or chronic pain, that's emotional repression. It would have been like, oh, okay, well,
Mhm.
I can do something else here. I don't have to do the rearranging of the deck chairs.
Yeah, it just makes me wonder if I go back in those years, would I have been open to KI? I don't know. It's different consciousness or a different world maybe but I just think, I mean, I would have listened everybody who wants to comment or let us know in some way if you're in early recovery, whether listening to a message like this just scares you off or resonates. But what do you think that Dan would be like? Okay, think about this before we end it. When your mom was pressuring you, could somebody have said, "Well, that's buried anger," to you? I mean, let's address that issue too in early recovery, where you're just trying to respond to people who are pressuring you, or you want to get sober.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. God, I don't even know if I would have heard it or if I would have believed the person that was saying it to me, you know? I'm not even sure. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think you hear it when you hear it and you hear it when you're ready to hear it, but I think it's like I think for me it was also that no one was saying it. Really, honestly, I've never heard people talk about this. I haven't, you know? Um,
Hmm.
so I do think I feel some kind of like responsibility. I feel like a healthy responsibility to be like, hey, you know, if
Yeah.
you have ears to hear or whatever, check this out. Listen, you know, see if this resonates with you, you know.
It can be a little bit threatening too. I mean, we both experienced that. I remember when we were in the hot tub and you were, if you remember this, you were kind of, we talked about it on podcast maybe somewhere. You had one foot in the 12 step and one foot in an inquiry process to see
Mhm.
what was driving things. What was it like for you at that point? Because some people will be there. It's like we don't go in or we're not just in or out something. People come to here when they're still in 12 step, for example. So what was it like? Do you remember that when you were one foot in, one foot out?
Yeah, I do. I do. You called it no man's land, I think, where it was like
Mm.
I still part of my system was still wanting to revert back to 12 step, and then part of my system knew I had to continue to deprogram and do the inquiry work, you know. And yeah, I think the system fight, and that's the thing is that the worldview or the belief or system or the belief or whatever it is the safety, you know? And so that's the way that I've been staying repressed and safe for so long is by being in that structure, you know? And so as we know with emotional oppression work, as we go deeper into the body, we realize that the body actually is fighting for the suffering state. It's like it's safer to be in the worldview or in the belief system than it is to dismantle it, you know? Because if we dismantle it, then we have to really be ourselves and feel and express what's true, you know? And that's like the biggest
Exactly.
fear, you know? That's like the scariest thing for our systems.
Yeah. Totally.
So,
Because
yeah.
I've even said, go ahead, finish your thought. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I just, you know, so it was like you were so good about it at the time. You were like, well, consider this, you know, consider that, you know, maybe the abstinence or whatever it is, your beliefs around being sexual, that you know, there's some issues there, you know?
Yeah. Okay, so speaking of like worldviews and how it's scary, even when you said, Dan, that, it's safer to be connected to the program than it is to go inquire into the root of my suffering. Um, I thought there's also that's we're getting love there. So that's two basic needs that makes it scary that people aren't aware of, and I wasn't either. The way I got through that was when I would leave meetings, I would get my dose of love and approval, and then I would go home and process things and felt more and more, stable in my experience. And then eventually left the 12-step program because it wasn't scary, through my own investigation. I got over the fear of leaving that support system and that getting my needs met. But it got into teaching. I still got my needs met that way. So I wasn't done. I never got to buried anger. My
Yeah.
point is, yeah, well, I don't want to go into that, the spiritual bypass part, but I want you to hear your view of this. And I'll tell you mine or my experience with this is the abandoning yourself part. People could listen to this and say, well, that's scary to think that, okay, I've abandoned myself, but I don't know what myself is. And if myself involves anger, that's scary. And if myself involves in some way showing these parts of myself, that's scary. So it's just safer to be a good boy. But what I've noticed and I've been able to really rely on is that when I started to process the buried anger, the suffering started going away. I mean, truly, my pain, it wasn't all at once, but it was very in total in a way over time, so many different areas. And then my recovery changed. So I didn't rely on a worldview. And what I'm saying is like, if you're drinking the KI Kool-Aid, anyone, that's just another landing because it'll just be another worldview because what KI will bring you, if you're willing to let go of it in the end, the words, the meaning, then it's just giving you that self back you abandoned. And that's what I wanted to say because my recovery has been about no longer abandoning myself, but it's not scary. It's been my suffering's gone away. And my recovery doesn't have any anxiety in it because my body determines all of that. And I trust my body. And therefore, things fall away when it's time and not a minute before, is how I've noticed it. And I can trust that because that's part of self trust. So, anything you want to say about letting go of worldviews and then trusting yourself and,
I mean,
after self?
you said it pretty well. I don't know if I could say it better, but that's the I will say it's scary as hell, but I think that's the point because that's the repression. The repression is the fear, you know what I mean? It's like that's the fear in the body, and it's like it is really liberating for me too. It's like the suffering just keeps diminishing the more I process the buried anger and the frozen fear that's in the body around it, you know?
Mhm.
And yeah, and it's really, frankly, sometimes I sit back because the more that I do the work, the more skillful I get, the more I realize how simple it is. You know, how simple sort of the process is, meaning I just have to get, no matter what the trigger is that comes up for me, at root, I'm angry and I'm afraid of it, you know?
Yes.
And so if
Yeah.
I could just go there and go, I'm angry, I'm angry, I'm angry, and I'm afraid, and really skillfully work with it, then the problems on the level of the mind just start to dissolve and fall away. They truly do, you know?
They do.
Um,
And, I was also thinking this another thing is it's look at how complicated we make it. I mean, I just listened to your story and you know mine. Is it look at all the directions you went in and all the worldviews and all the ways in which you tried to get love, but you never got to the root and how complicated that is. And then when we get to the depth work here, it ends up being just a couple of programs under all of it. Right? Like
yeah,
people don't
yeah,
know that. And they think because I talk a lot that this is complicated. I'm like, you have no idea how simple this is. But our entire life is just built to make sure we don't see it.
yeah. It's borderline embarrassing actually sometimes. So like, oh my God, trying to think myself in so many different directions, and this is just really, yeah, like you said, a couple different programs and a couple different emotions that I need to just get to and work with for a period of time. And yeah,
Yeah,
and it feels it does when we say authentic recovery, it feels like authentic because during the process, I really start to trust that I can resolve my own suffering, you know, that I really can. I see the results of it happening as I do it, you know.
well, the great thing is there's also community and relationship in that because as long as we just fucking leave each other alone and long enough, and unless we need help with like accessing things, because we can't be, in other words, it can be a really, like we do mentorship with people here. So we're not setting up the atmosphere that here are the tools and figure it out because you and I both know that, well,
Yeah,
look at our lives. It's like, well, even if we give people the KI tools, well, they'll go back to getting their needs met, just go back to the same pattern. They don't come back to the, so it's not like relationship isn't helpful, but you and I have worked through so much codependency on our own that we haven't talked about. Even through 12 step we were sponsors, I'm sure. Well, I don't know if you were, I was, but
I was,
you're a
yeah.
helper. Yeah, you were. And so yeah, I just want anything else you want to say about that because we do have a different way now. It's not just um a gloomy story around codependency and not getting better really.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's way different for me now than it was in 12 step when I sponsored people because that was definitely my helping and a lot of that was coming from I have to help people to stay sober and I have to do it so that they'll like me and so they'll see me as a great sponsor or a spiritual, guy that knows what he's talking about or whatever.
Get love.
Get love. Um, and so now, yeah, the way that we do it now, it feels so much cleaner because it's sort of like, okay, we introduce the tools to people, we introduce the context, and we say, if you want to do this, um, then this is how you do it, and show me that you want to do it, and I'll help you through it, and I'll do it in a way that's like Rob, like my sponsor Rob that I was talking about, where it's like
Hmm.
I'll be really direct with you all the way through, and I won't be codependent with you, you
Hmm.
know, and I'll
Yeah.
give you that the space that you need to come back into the ability to trust yourself, you know.
Yeah, it's almost like as soon as you get someone to help you, if you need their love or vice versa, boy, you'd better make that a part of the relationship in some way to make it conscious because it's going to run it, you know?
Yep. Yep.
All right. Well,
Totally.
thanks, Dan, for coming on. I know Dan will come on again, and then I'm going to put a link, um, at least the link to Dan, his clarity call to come talk to Dan if you want to work with him. He does mentorship in different forms, and I think you can just come. Clarity call Dan is how you want people to reach you.
Yeah, that's probably the best way. Clarity call on Kiloby.com. Yeah.
All right. Thanks for coming, Dan. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, man.